yes, the point here, the reason why it's important to understand that radicals are a minority is that what is the majority? Yeah, we refer to this as a silent majority. I mentioned this earlier in the day. This silent majority is actually going to have kind of a political movement in the 1970s. Does anybody remember what that political movement is going to be called? The moral majority. And this would be a huge support behind Reagan, moral majority. But the silent majority is basically saying we are not radical, decidedly not radical. These guys support free enterprise. In other words, they support a free market. They also, by the way, support racial equality. But as far as they're concerned, what's the cause of the inequality? As much as anything, it's radicalism, it's people being jerks. It's not necessarily the economy. And so by doing this, this creates another realignment on the Republican side. And this is not uncommon. You should understand this. If you have a realignment from one party, it's rare for the other party not to be affected. We saw this, unfortunately, in 1932. I shouldn't say unfortunately, but in terms of explaining things. FDR moves to this active government. What do most of the Republicans want in the 1930s? They also want, they just want less active government. But the voice of Hoover and Coolidge is gone for about 10, 15 years. It was such a landslide for FDR that the Republicans get a little bit gun-shy. Now, they begin to reemerge in the 1950s. And so when you think of today, when we say conservatives, usually you're thinking economic conservatives. This is emerging in the late 1950s, early 1960s. People like Ronald Reagan, right? By the time he gets to the 1980s, he's on this argument of economic conservatism. Now, there is just one last little thing. I don't want to confuse you, but we talked about liberal, right, and conservative. And we've been talking about economic issues. And on the economic spectrum, a liberal wants to have a more active federal or just plain government. And what does the conservative want? More restrained, right? Okay. What about politics? If we talk about political conservative, this was something that was even a little bit older than economic conservative stuff. So, political liberal, what do you want? Bigger government, which means bigger federal influence. What about a political conservative? Smaller, which means more state influence. Sometimes referred to as states' rights. Now, does this equate to states' rights like pre-Civil War states' rights? No, that's a little bit different. That's not political or liberal or conservative. What would the pre-Civil War states' rights would be the equivalent of a radical in the 1860s? What are they shooting for? They're not shooting for constitutional or they're looking for confederation. That's what the Southerners did. They just got rid of it completely. We don't want any federal government. That's a little bit on the extreme side. But when you are under a federal system, you had those that wanted more states' rights and those that wanted less. How about this one? This is the big one today. Moral. What would be liberal, moral, morally liberal, and morally conservative? Today, what we say instead of moral, we say social issues. That's kind of the buzzword, social issues.
Things need to change, things need to stay.
So, which one would be which? What would the liberals be?
They want change.
Change? Okay. Well, what does that mean? Moral conservatives want a lot of things to change.
Things conservative is that more traditional, and liberal wants like a new way of doing
Okay. So what is more traditional? How do we define traditional morality?
So, like, same-sex marriage, like pro-life, that would be more of a conservative stance on this stuff.
Yes,
Moral
that's right.
issue.
Yes. But why?
Because that's how it's been.
That's how it was.
How about I give you this idea? And I'll put it on the conservative side because you kind of understand this. Or it should be irrelevant. But how does that mean? What does that mean?
It's kind of a little bit leading.
Well, kind of.
Like that.
Let me put it this way. Natural law, relative law. That also is far more commonly used, but what's the difference between the two? What does natural law mean?
There's an absolute and that relative law. You just kind of change with the society what needed at that moment.
So how's the difference between, is there an association between the belief in absolute, belief in natural law and belief in God? We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. This means that it wasn't given to them, that God gave them to them. No God. Then what happens to that whole argument?
It's more utilitarianism. Marxism.
Well, how do you argue it? How do you get the natural rights? Well, if there's no natural law, then and there's no God, then why would there be a natural law? So you say most people agree that for the sake of most of the people, that we should all respect most of their rights, right? So relative law means that it's based almost like on a plurality. This is something, and it's sad. I just have to tell you, it's sad, and the reason why it's sad is that, unfortunately, a lot of our education folks are scared to talk about this. Your philosophy professor will be more likely to talk about this. But if they're not in philosophy, they're just scared to talk about this, which is really ironic. I don't want to get into why it's so painfully ironic, but it's really screaming irony. And what they're talking about is the basis of what it means to have a natural law or a relative morality. It does go back to your view of God. I say either no God or I say irrelevant God. In other words, you can say, well, I'm sure God may exist, but it doesn't matter because He doesn't actually define anything for me. That's the same as if you say, well, God doesn't exist at all. Yes?
Could this also be defined as the one side saying it is my belief in what God is what morality is, and the other one says everyone has their own God and their own morality?
Which is right up there with it's irrelevant, right? Because it's relative to what you think. Now, the only reason why I'm saying this is that when we talk about moral conservative, if you start listing off what moral conservatives believe, then you don't actually have an understanding of the cause behind it. Or what social moral liberals would believe. You don't have an understanding of the cause that goes behind it. We have that here. Big government, active government, restraint, and then the issues follow that presumption. It's the same thing on this side. Now, one of the interesting things here is that there is no necessarily saying this is Democrat, this is conservative. In 1965, you had majority, whether you're Republican or Democrat, going to be conservative on moral issues. You're going to be more or less split on political issues and strongly split on economic issues. When FDR gets to be president, he turns this into a political issue. So when they talk about liberal or conservative, they're usually talking about fiscal. What happens in 65 and later in 73 when we start talking about legalization of birth control and legalization of abortion? what suddenly enters into the political arena?
The morals.
The moral issues. And this becomes a political issue, which means that the parties begin to divide over this issue. The same-sex issues are going to be later, but they're going to follow the same path. Prior to same-sex issues, we're dealing with divorce. No-fault divorce laws were spreading through the early 70s. And so this was kind of the beginning. So this concept of who's morally liberal and who's morally conservative was not on the table in 1960 when Kennedy is running for president. It's not really on the table even when Nixon and the Democrats are running. It becomes an issue in the 70s. So these different levels of division. Today, when we think when we think conservative liberal, there's lots of different aspects. But it wasn't so in 1930, different in 1960. And I mentioned this last week. If you start talking about a Democrat in 1930, it's not accurate to say, well, he's a Democrat, he's liberal. What do you mean by that? You have to really define what you mean by liberal or conservative, because the meaning is different, just as it is today. Much of this change is going to happen right in the early 70s. Why is it relevant? I'll tell you. If we're talking about radicalism, radicalism is to kind of overthrow the system. And it's easy to talk in terms of economics. But what could the system also be?
Yes, so you're leading to morality.
Morality. It could be any number of things. But yeah, morality. And so if you associate Dems with radicals, then you open this broad door for all sorts of things. Now, I'm going to tell you this, and I want you to be subtle in understanding. 1972. The Democrats are generally more liberal than Republicans. Does this mean that most of your Democrats would at all align themselves with radical ideology? No. Not only that, I mentioned in 1972, right, Republicans tend to be conservative. But what about Nixon? Is Nixon a conservative? When a Reaganite thinks back at Nixon, does he think conservative? No, he didn't do anything to overturn the Great Society, the war on poverty stuff. He creates new agencies, really big, giant agencies like the EPA. Now, it didn't start big and giant, but today it's huge, right? He creates these agencies. So people don't think of Nixon as being a conservative. Yet in our head, because today we think Republican, conservative, Democrat, liberal, we think, oh, Nixon must have been a conservative. What about Ford? And nobody knows anything about Ford.
Fell down.
Football player. Fell down, yeah. Very famous for that. Saturday Night Live made fun of him for years. Ford would be kind of a moderate Republican. He didn't have any intention of overturning any of this stuff. There was a book in 1964 by a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. I actually worked for her. I transcribed her videos onto digital DVDs in the early 2000s. So when I was getting my doctorate, this is how I earned my money. I was an advisor, student advisor for the honors program at St. Louis University, and I worked at Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum. And my job was to take all of her DVD or videotapes. She had videotapes that went back to the late 70s and put them onto DVD. She had like 1,500 of them. It took forever. So that means I was watching these videos. And she wrote this book. The reason why she's got any name at all, I'll tell you that in the 1980s, she becomes one, there's lots of them, of Reagan's advisors. Right? So obviously, which side of the fence is she on? Conservative or liberal? Take a wild guess.
Liberal.
No, she's conservative, very much so. Okay. She is responsible for ending the ERA. What is the ERA? Anybody heard of this?
Equal Rights Amendment?
Equal Rights Amendment. She's a woman, right? And why would she be against the Equal Rights Amendment? Wouldn't every woman want equal rights? What's her argument? That this actually hurts women. It's not about equal rights. Her argument was that the Equal Rights Amendment would get rid of all things that gave any preference to women. So if you're Social Security, your husband dies, what happens to the wife? Let's say you didn't work a day in your life. What do you get?
Nothing.
Under ERA, that was a threat, but in fact, you get your husband's, right? Because there's a certain presumption there. Well, at the time, she was also arguing, well, what happens if you make no distinction between men and women? You could have same-sex marriage. And the people on the other side were saying, oh, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Nobody would ever be calling for same-sex marriage. Which is kind of fucking nice, actually. So, this is in the 70s. She was part of this, what you would call the moral majority. And the argument was that this wasn't anything to do with equal rights. What it was really about was this radical opposition. It was an attempt to destroy the system. And in this case, the system was anything that had any traditional values, to get rid of it all. And she was successful, actually. Where am I at? So the ERA, this was in the 1970s. But what got her famous wasn't ERA prior to this. She was most famous in 1964. She wrote a book called A Choice, Not an Echo. Won't make any sense to you at all. Unless you get the context. And her argument was that the Republicans in 1964 were basically Democrats light. They believed everything the Democrats believed. They were just less of it. And she said, if you really want to do something, let's have a real conservative candidate. So that would mean that the voters would have a choice, not an echo. You get it? Echo, not a choice. Choice, not an echo. Well, this was a huge success, actually. And in fact, sold 1 million copies. Huge amounts of money. Very successful. She was supporting a person named Barry Goldwater. And what happened in the 1964 election? This is super easy to understand.
Didn't win.
Why?
Because he's not Kennedy.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Kennedy is dead. Nobody is going to win against LBJ. When LBJ kind of looks on Kennedy's, I should say, death streams. So the fact of the matter is, Goldwater loses terribly in 64, and so people then look at this and they say, oh, Goldwater is conservative, therefore, after the 1964 election, conservatism is dead. That was the argument. Any of these ideas been killed because he was so soundly trounced. Now that would probably be true if people were voting in 1964 on economic issues. What are they actually voting in 1964?
Emotions.
Emotions. They love JFK. That's what they're voting on. That's the reason. It has nothing to do with economics. It doesn't really even have enough to do with civil rights, although it's going to kind of seal the deal. By 65, once LBJ is already in office, that's when, or he gets elected, that's when we make that huge connection with the war on poverty. Okay. And when that happens, what we find is that conservatism wasn't dead. And that when Nixon wins in 68, some of these ideas of the radicalism are just totally not supported. Why am I trying to? Even within Republicans, there was a debate between liberals and conservatives. So what do you think is going to happen within the Democrats? Debate between liberals and conservatives. I think we covered the LBJ swing. I think we covered the Nixon law and order. Okay. But I want to cover, after our break here, is I want you to tell me why Watergate was so huge. And then I want you to tell me how it has any relationship to Vietnam, to President Carter, and indirectly to Ronald Reagan. And I'll give you a hint. Some of it has to do with the fact that conservative, liberal, radical, not real defined. And I'll let you ponder that while we get on break. Questions, comments, words of wisdom? Okay, we'll come back at about 6:30-ish or so.